Welcome. Welcome to Move to Learn, the Handspring webinar series for manual therapists and movement educators. Our guest today is Trina Altman, who's the author of Yoga Deconstructed, Movement Science Principles for Teaching. I'm your host, Elizabeth Larkham. Before introducing Trina, let's take a look at how things work during this webinar. The webinar will comprise roughly 45 minutes of discussion, presentation, and guided practice, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Trina plans a movement practice for you and recommends that you have a mat, a blanket or pillow, and a yoga block or pile of books so you can use that for your practice. The chat is on, so do say hello and tell us where you're joining from. We welcome your questions and ask that you please submit these questions using the Q&A button on your screen. We aim to finish on the hour, but may continue for 10 minutes after the hour to ensure that Trina can answer as many questions as you have. We're recording the webinar and we'll share a link to it in the follow-up email. This webinar is streaming live on YouTube. And we draw your attention to the disclaimer that this webinar with discussion and participation, is for informational and illustrative purposes only and is not meant to impart medical or therapeutic advice or instruction. Good morning to all on the chat, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Trina Altman. Trina Altman is the creator of Yoga Deconstructed and Pilates Deconstructed, both of which show movement teachers and clinicians how to create a more sustainable practice through an interdisciplinary approach based on current movement science. Trina has over 10 years of teaching experience. She was part of the faculty for the Brain Longevity Conference at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles. Her work has been published in Yoga Journal, Yoga International, and Pilates Style magazines. Trina Altman's classes and courses have been featured on Yoga International, Yoga Anytime, and Fusion Pilates EDU. Trina consulted for Equinox in the development of their program Best Stretch Ever. Trina, welcome to Move to Learn. I'm so excited to find out from you what is behind the cover of this fabulous book.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited for today's session. And yes, this beautiful whimsical cover, as you described it, which I love, it's colorful, is designed by Diana Gary, who is an incredible illustrator. She has designed book covers for a lot of children's books and does all kinds of artwork. So I found her and discovered her on Instagram and highly recommend you checking out her work.
So I know you've prepared a movement practice for us and also embedded it within slides taken from some of the chapters, the theory in your book. So please take us through it.
All right, I'm going to share my screen and we will head over to the PowerPoint. Okay. So good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This presentation today is called Introduction to Creative Sequencing with Somatics. And my book covers a plethora of topics, and I decided to zero in on somatics because I've had a lot of interest in that portion of my book. So for today, we have some objectives. The first is to understand the definition and benefits of somatic movement. to identify how somatics applies to yoga, to experience somatic movement in your own body, and to learn the foundations of somatic cueing. So first, let's start with what is somatic movement. The definition of somatics is it's a field of study that's derived from the Greek word soma. And within the context of movement, somatics can be defined as how the mind and body are perceived from within to self-correct and heal. And I know there could be a lot of confusion about what does somatics mean, because it's a really broad term. It can be in reference to somatic psychology, it could be in reference to body work, but for today's purposes and in regard to my work and how I've been influenced, I'm speaking of somatics in terms of movement. So the three pioneers of somatic movement that I have been influenced by and lucky enough to have been able to take regular weekly classes in are Hannah Somatic, Feldenkrais, and Irmgard Bartenieff. And I'll start with Hannah Somatic. Thomas Hanna was a philosopher, and he's the author of a book called Somatics, which I highly recommend. I saw my mom is on the call, which I'm so excited. She actually gifted me that book by Thomas Hanna. I have to think it was maybe like 20 years ago, and I still have it and refer to it. And so Thomas Hanna was a philosopher and an early student of Moshe Feldenkrais, who popularized somatic education. And Moshe Feldenkrais, he incorporated principles from physics, neurology, and martial arts to open up new movement patterns using differentiation of the joint and conscious repetition. And then the third pioneer of somatic movement that I've been influenced by, her name is Irmgard Bartenieff. And she brought somatic movement to the dance community as a method to teach movement efficiency by experiencing body connections through deep and superficial kinetic chains. I was really lucky to take weekly Feldenkrais classes. They're called ATM classes, or awareness through movement classes, as well as I took an adult beginner modern dance class weekly. And I really enjoyed the first 45 minutes, which was Bartenieff fundamentals. And then once we got up and had to dance, it wasn't my favorite because I'm not a dancer. But from learning so much from those two disciplines, as well as from Hannah Somatic, I just was always thinking about my clients and my students, which if you're a teacher, I'm sure you have the same experience. You learn something new and immediately different students and clients pop into your head, and you're thinking about how you can use what you've learned to help them. Let's see, I think I was gonna say before we move on, one more thing. A lot of people ask me in the most general terms, how would you describe the difference between these three pioneers in terms of the movement style? And I found a nice way of describing it is baby bear, mama bear, papa bear. So baby bear, I think of as Feldenkrais because the movements are really small. Mama bear is Hannah Somatic, where the movements are a little bit bigger, but still similar to Feldenkrais. And then for Bartenieff fundamentals, I think of like Papa Bear. The movements are very big. So if you've seen like the X rolling patterns, things of that nature, that is derived from Irmgard Bartenieff. So I hope that's helpful. And we're going to experience some movement, which I know will also be helpful. So I could go on and on about these three pioneers, but this is a short 1 hour session. I do have a 12-hour course on this topic if you want to dive deeper. But for now, I have these three websites. So if you want to investigate further and do, say, a full training in any of these three modalities, I am not certified or trained in any of these three modalities. I've just been a regular weekly practitioner of the different types of movement. Okay, So this brings us to, why would you want to include somatics in your yoga classes? The first reason that I think is really important is including somatics in your yoga class can help your students create new brain connections without a preconceived notion of aesthetics. Yoga has become extremely popular and well known in the last 20 to 30 years in the West. And most people have an image in their mind of what a yoga pose looks like. If you say downward dog, they have a visual of the shape in their brain. And so that often can lead to a lot of maybe striving or trying to fit yourself into a box, as opposed to making the pose customized for yourself. And somatics is different in the sense that when you teach a somatic movement, there aren't any preconceived notion of a shape or an aesthetic, which often leads your students to more exploration and possibly new motor patterns. The second reason why I think you might want to include somatics in your yoga classes is it helps bring new insight to more global movements. So I think of yoga poses as pretty global movements. They're generally large shapes where multiple joints are in their end ranges of motion. And what I love about somatics and how it complements yoga so well is that somatic movements are often really small movements. And so by doing smaller, slower movements before you do larger, bigger movements more quickly, say in a flow style, you'll learn things that you wouldn't learn if you hadn't actually done the smaller movements first. Thirdly, I love teaching somatics in my yoga classes because it exposes my students to an inquiry-based learning style. And I'm a big fan of all learning styles, so visual, kinesthetic, auditory, for teaching movement. And then I'm also a fan of all types of cueing, so internal cueing, external cueing, kinesthetic feedback-based cueing. I do find that traditionally when we teach modern postural yoga, the cues are generally more commands or like very precise instruction, which I think can be really helpful in a lot of ways. But I do see the downside to that, which is a lot of times it might take away your students' empowerment into trusting their own body. So somatic cues are often questions rather than commands, and that encourages more of an inquiry-based learning style and a sense of choice for your students when they're in the poses that they're practicing. And then fourthly, somatics helps promote movement autonomy and reduce stress. So I mentioned about the autonomy in the previously, but in terms of reducing stress, most somatic movements are done on the floor. They're ground-based. And so you're very supported. You're not dealing with gravity so much. And especially if you start your classes with a somatic sequence, people are often, a little bit harried and stressed out because they're rushing to get to class so they can relax. And doing a lot of ground-based slow movements can help get people into a little bit more of a parasympathetic state. All right, and actually I got a little ahead of myself. So yes, somatics is a ground-based movement, but I didn't mention how, of course, not dealing with gravity is going to relieve some of the muscle guarding and tension that we have to be upright, to be seated or standing. And just that sense of support from the floor helps students to relax. The other thing that's so wonderful about feedback from the floor is you're able to notice nuance of your movements with less effort. So for example, an area of the body that's really difficult for many people to map in their brain is the back of their body, because we can't see the back of our body. And especially say things like your shoulder blades or your upper back spine is really hard to sense. And even sometimes touch, depending on the range of motion you have in your shoulders and arms. But when you're lying on the floor, you can really tell like which shoulder blade feels maybe a little heavier than the other on the ground, or how maybe your upper back spine feels a connection to the floor, but maybe less of a connection in the lower back spine. So you learn anatomy, just keep me on track with time, in a very embodied way. All right, and then lastly for this slide, somatics can teach you how to distribute effort and forces more evenly, which can apply to larger movements and yoga poses. So for example, say you're doing a yoga pose that involves rotation or twisting. And a lot of times in yoga, we'll just take our hands and like grab a body part and kind of twist as far as we can go without maybe paying attention to like, oh, wow, I'm really rotating a lot in one area of my spine and not as much in another. And there's a lot of somatic movement sequences that you can do where you really can clue in and sort of clock into which areas of your spine you're rotating. In fact, the one we're going to do today is really useful with that. All right, more reasons. So somatics are a way to understand larger movements and poses that are practiced later on in class because they create new brain connections without a preconceived notion of aesthetics. And so when I'm creating a class, usually the first thing I think about, especially if I'm leading up to a complicated pose that requires a lot of range of motion, is what the directions of movement are at each joint in that pose. And usually the requirements are quite high in terms of flexibility. And so I will pick a somatic sequence that involves those same directions of movement at those same joints. But of course, we'll be doing them in a smaller, slower way to warm up the body and create these new connections. Somatic movements are smaller pieces of movement that people are familiar with. So they're easy to cue, but they do bring new insight to these more global movements. We often, life is fast, and it's a lot of times just about getting things done, getting in your movement practice, and slowing down with these smaller movements often gets all these light bulb connections, which is my favorite when I'm teaching light bulb connections for my students that they haven't experienced before when we get to the yoga asanas later on in class. Okay, so enough talking. Let's experience how somatics can prepare your body for yoga poses. So we are going to do a somatic sequence, and that somatic sequence is going to help prepare us for twisted triangle pose. So we will actually do twisted triangle pose and then experience the somatic sequence and then do twisted triangle pose again at the end to see what has changed. So I'm going to move my computer just so that you'll be able to see me and my whole mat, and then we will get started. As far as props go, you don't need anything, but if you do want to have some props, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing so that we've got this whole screen. You could grab a blanket or a towel if you want padding underneath your head. We'll be lying on our side. Here we go. Let's see. Sorry, just high-tech staging going on, making sure the yoga blocks are supporting my computer are even. Okay, I think we are good to go. Yes, we're in frame. All right, and then the other props that you might want to gather is for twisted triangle pose. So if you like doing it with a chair or yoga blocks, you can grab those, or books if you don't have yoga blocks. Okay, so to get started, and for me, I'm in California. It is very early in the morning. I haven't done any movement yet today. So I'm going to do twisted triangle using the chair, just so it's a little bit less range of motion in the hips. So let's get started. We're going to have your left foot forward and your right foot back. And you can put both of your hands either on the blocks or on the chair to start. Your right foot will be slightly turned out, And you can make this a big stance or a smaller stance. And then place your right hand underneath your chest to the inside of your left foot or on the chair like I'm doing, and take your left hand to your sacrum. And then just pause here for a moment, inhale, and feel your connection to the floor through your feet, and sense your spine from your sacrum where your hand is all the way up to lower back, middle back, upper back, and crown of your head. And then begin to press your right hand into the floor or the block or the chair as you start to rotate your head and chest to the left. And this is without moving your pelvis. So just notice your range of motion and thoracic rotation without turning your pelvis. And then we're going to rotate the pelvis. And if you like, you can reach your left arm up towards the sky. And just take a moment to notice how it feels, as well as to connect to your breath. And then we'll unwind and repeat that on the other side. One side is always different from the other. Actually, Elizabeth always says, I love when you say, Elizabeth, one side is always different from the other, and Pilates teachers will always have work to do, jobs to do. So we've got right foot forward, left foot back, left foot is slightly turned out, and then right hand comes to your sacrum. And again, just take a moment to feel your connection through your hands, through your feet. Start to observe and sense from the inside out your spine. And then as you press your left hand into the chair or the floor or the block, you'll keep your pelvis where it is, but start to turn your head and chest to the right. So noticing how much thoracic rotation is available to you now without judging it. And then let's add the turn of the pelvis, noticing how that gives you more rotation and reaching your arm up towards the sky. All right. So for the somatic sequence, we're gonna lie on our side. I'm gonna start on my right side, and I'm gonna use a blanket just as a little bit extra support underneath my head, but you could always lie on your arm. And then the other option is if you want something in between your knees, not necessary, but if you like, you can put a blanket or a block between your knees. And then get really comfortable on your right side with your arms straight out in line from your shoulders. And take a moment here to let the entire right side of your body melt into the floor. And then bring your drishti, your gaze point, to your hands and start to reach your top hand past the bottom hand, and notice how that rolls your head and chest towards the floor. Again, you can make sure you've got some padding under your face. Then we'll reverse the movements. There's a lot of reversibility in somatic sequences, which I love. So you're rolling your head and chest towards the ceiling, and then your left hand just naturally slides in the opposite direction along the inside of your right forearm. And we'll continue like this. And go slowly. You can have your eyes open or closed, but just taking time to get out of your thinking mind and into your feeling body. And the constraint for this movement is that your elbows stay straight, especially your top elbow. So this becomes more of a spinal rotation adventure and not just an elbow bending sort of arm adventure. And when we employ these constraints, what happens is it limits what you're doing to a certain extent, and it helps you to discover things you might not normally discover. One more time, back and forth. And then the next time your palms connect, we're going to take our arms to a different angle. So let's go slightly upward. If this was maybe, like 9 o'clock, now we're at say 10 or 11, and you can adjust your blanket or your pillow as needed. But otherwise it's the same. You'll roll and reach your top hand past the bottom hand. And it doesn't even have to go past the bottom hand, right? It might just be reaching, you know, and there's a millimeter or so. So we are all different. And this is not about it looking a certain way. It's about feeling. If you're an anatomy nerd, you might go, oh, wow, this upward rotation of my shoulder blade feels amazing. You know, I'm feeling, you know, new stretching sensations at T3 and 4. But if you're not an anatomy geek, or even if you are, just this soothing sensation of rocking, which isn't something we generally do in our yoga practice. In Pilates, we do a lot of rocking, which I love, can be really relaxing for the nervous system. One more time. For having cued breath, you're welcome to breathe naturally, or you could link your breath to different portions of the movement. And this also doesn't have to be continuous. So if there's somewhere along the way you want to pause and check in and be still, please feel free to do that. Okay, so the next time your palms connect, we're going to do one last diagonal. So we're straight out, we did an upward diagonal, and now we're at this lower diagonal, which means in order to have a little padding under your face when you roll, you might have to adjust your blanket. And then you begin rolling your face, your chest towards the floor, reaching your top hand and arm. Feels really nice, the protraction of the left shoulder blade. And observing how there's bone rhythms happening here. Things go together. So when you roll forward, there's going to be a little more spinal flexion and scapular protraction. And when you roll backwards, you might notice maybe your spine moving into more extension and perhaps a little scapular retraction. And not because you're muscling your way through it, it just kind of happens naturally. We'll go one more time, observing how it might feel just slightly different through different areas of your back and your spine, just simply by changing the angle of which your arms are pointing. Okay, so next time your palms come together, if you have something between your knees, you can get rid of that. And then you'll bring your arms to shoulder height and you'll interlace your fingers. So this is where we began. But then take your head so you can see your knees. And just like we did with the top arm, you're going to slide your top thigh and knee forward, past your bottom knee, and then you'll slide it backwards. And as you watch this happen, you might notice I'm cueing your knees and your thighs, but something is happening in your pelvis. Your pelvis is rotating. But your neck spine, your thoracic spine are staying still, and this constraint of the fingers interlaced helps with that. You can continue, or if you want to play with something that's a little extra that I like to play with, as you slide your top knee forward, I'm kind of pulling my right hand and arm back. My fingers are interlaced, so nothing's moving too big. And then as I slide my top knee backwards, I'm pushing my right hand forward and pulling my left hand back. Now, you don't see any of this movement because my fingers are interlaced. It's more of an isometric. But just notice if when you do that, you feel any different sensations than you were feeling without doing it. Last time, top knee slides forward and back. And of course, this is a rotation that happens in gait when you're walking. All right, so we're gonna switch over to the other side. And good, I'm on track with time. So you'll be lying on your left side. You can roll over. I'm going to face you so that you can see me in case you want any visual instruction. And again, you can do the block between your knees or not. We're going to start with our arms in line with our shoulders. And make sure you've got a little bit of cushion for your face. You'll roll your head and chest towards the floor, reaching. I'm right-handed, so the side is always like, oh, why haven't you done this sooner, Trina? Why didn't you do this yesterday and the day before? And then reversing the movement. So thoracic rotation, letting your head go along for the ride. And I didn't talk much about eye gaze. When we were on the other side, I just mentioned how you could have your eyes open or closed, but you could play around with really using your eye gaze. So when you roll your head and chest towards the ceiling, trying to look at the floor out of the corner of your right eye. And when you roll your face and chest towards the floor, maybe looking out of the corner of your left eye behind you. And see if that changes your experience of the movement. In my situation, it actually makes the movement a little bit bigger. So we could play with doing the opposite, right? We're explorers, or somanats, as Gil Headley says. So as you reach your top hand forward, instead of looking out of the left corner of your left eye behind you, try looking out of the right corner of your eye at your right hand. And then the opposite. So as your head and chest turn to the right, track your gaze and look out of your left eye, your left thumb. Ooh. So right, our body is moving one way, but our eyes are moving the opposite way. One more time. It requires a little bit extra thought, but it's really nice to disassociate the movement of your eyes from the movement of your body for so many reasons, but especially these days that we're looking at computers and screens so much. Okay, arms go at the upward diagonal, and you roll and reach. And then reverse the direction. And this movement can be teeny tiny, small. It does not need to be a big movement. Do try to keep your legs still. This is part of a Feldenkrais lesson that I absolutely love, and we're doing a very truncated version. So the variables, instead of having your arms go just at 3 different diagonals, you could do every number on the clock, and same thing with your knees and your legs, different angles. And more pauses and checking in on the back. Okay, last time at this upward diagonal. And then the next time your hands connect, we'll take our arms to that lower diagonal. And if you have a pillow, you might need to adjust it so that when you roll and reach, your nose doesn't get smushed on the floor. And allow your breath to slow down. Give yourself a time to let your ribs, your belly expand during your inhalation phase. And on the exhalation phase, elongating it so that your breath pattern is slower than it is in your regular daily life. Let's go one more time. And then the next time your palms connect, bring your arms back in line with your shoulders, interlace your fingers. So we've got this constraint. And then look down at your knees. So if they're far away, bring them a little closer so you can see them. And begin to slide your top thigh, your top femur bone and knee past the bottom knee. And then reverse it. Slide it backwards. And once you've watched it happen a couple times, this rotation of your pelvis, you can rest your head more of a neutral position and maybe take your gaze to your hands and play around with this sort of push-pull. So my fingers are interlaced. As my top knee goes backwards, I'm pushing through my right hand. But of course, my left fingers are limiting that. And as I slide my top knee forward, it's my bottom hand that's pushing and the top hand is pulling backwards. And what I love about doing this is it just connects you into your shoulder blades, your upper back in a gait pattern, right? So when you walk, your pelvis rotates in the opposite direction of your thoracic spine. If all of that seems like, oh no, too much, just slide your top leg forward and back. No need to visualize any sort of anatomical landmarks. Just enjoy your breath and your movement. All right, so the next time your knees are connected again, we're going to come up to seated and recheck the twisted triangle pose, Parvrita Trikonasana. So gather the props that you used before so that you have the same scenario. I'm going to take my chair back onto the mat just so it doesn't slide. And we'll start with the left foot forward, right foot back, right foot slightly turned out. Again, you determine your stance, whether it's wider or narrower. Make sure you're not on a balance beam. Have a little bit of, hip distance apart with your feet. And then right hand is going to go on the block, the floor, or the chair, directly underneath your breastbone, your chest. Left hand goes to your sacrum. Keep your pelvis still and start to twirl your chest. Start to feel how your shoulder moves back, and then turn your head and look up. And then you can add the rotation of your pelvis, which will take you further, and reach your arm up towards the sky. And if you can remember back to how it felt before, put that little snapshot in your brain, and then we'll switch sides. So right foot forward, left foot back, little external rotation of the back foot, leg, hip, and then your left hand will be right underneath your chest, right hand to your sacrum. And start by just grounding yourself. So pushing your hand into the floor, the chair, pressing both of your feet into the ground and lengthening through your spine. And without moving your pelvis, start to turn your head and chest. Notice how that feels. It feels a lot easier now. And then let your pelvis turn as well and reach your arm up to the sky. Pause here for a breath or two. Notice any changes. Might not necessarily be change in range of motion, but maybe you just feel more powerful and strong in this shape, more connected and grounded. And then bringing your arm back down, untwisting. And we're going to go back to just a little bit more with the PowerPoint, and then we'll finish up with questions. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. All right. And talk a little bit about somatic cues versus aesthetic cues. Let me get my little stool so I have something to sit on. All right. So yoga cues are often very aesthetic, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can cause fear sometimes in practicing movements for people when they're home alone, if they haven't taken classes in other movement modalities, because they'll think there's a right or wrong way to do something. If you're a teacher, I'm sure you've had this experience, whether it's Pilates teacher and somebody says, oh, well, in Pilates, they told us to engage our abs. So I've been engaging my abs, all day, every day, where they sort of take something that happens in one scenario and apply it to all scenarios. Or in yoga, in Tadasana, we stand with our feet perfectly parallel. And so I never stand, you know, with my feet slightly turned out or one out, one in, you know, in any other part of my life. And so what I do really like about somatic cueing is for folks who maybe have only been introduced to one movement modality and have that misunderstanding, they begin to learn when you incorporate somatics, say in your yoga class or your Pilates class, that they have choices and that there are options and that there isn't always one right way to do something because all of our bodies are different. So to sum that up, introducing somatic cueing can help students experience more autonomy and less fear around movement. And I talk a lot about pain science in my book and nocibic language and all of those things that I think somatics can be so useful for. All right, so examples of aesthetic cues, which can be very useful. We need to know where like the base level of like the thing that we're doing is. So, you know, whether that is seeing somebody else do it and, you know, using our mirror neurons, or that's hearing a cue and using that cue to find the position that we want is really helpful. So an example of this aesthetic cue would be line up the arch of your right foot with the heel of your left foot in, say, Warrior 2, Virabhadrasana 2. In Tadasana, bring your feet to parallel. In, say, Warrior 1 or Tree Pose, level the hips. Tuck the pelvis under, so cueing a posterior pelvic tilt. These can all be really useful. I think the problem arises, though, is if you're only using these cues, as I mentioned earlier, then sometimes things seem black and white when things are really shades of gray. All right, so examples of somatic cues are often questions, which I love because it gets your students thinking, because this is about what they're there for, it's to learn. So a cue I love to say, a somatic cue is, how can you make this movement more efficient? How can you make this movement easier? I remember taking Feldenkrais classes for the first time, and they would say things like, how can you make it less effortful? Or how can you make it feel a little lazier? I mean, talk about like something we need to hear, or I needed to hear. What other parts of your body can participate in this movement to make it easier? So for example, in Pilates, we often isolate certain movements one at a time in order to teach things. So don't move this and only move that, which is super useful. But then you also want to have the ability to have things move through the kinetic chain and let other parts of your body move in response. Another question you could ask, because especially in yoga, we tend to do big movements. What happens if you make this movement smaller? And that might encourage your students to feel something they might not have felt or noticed before. If you slow down your movement, can you notice more of your experience? So encouraging interoception, proprioception, kinesthesia, kinesthetic learning. Okay, so let's experience the difference between aesthetic cueing and somatic cueing in Warrior 2. So if you took a seat, you can just come back up to stand. The sun is coming out here. It's getting a little brighter, which is nice. All right, so for more of a traditional aesthetic cueing of Warrior 2 is what we'll start with. So separate your feet so that they are the width of your wrist. So when your arms are out to the side, your feet are directly underneath your wrist. Then externally rotate your left hip, leg, foot, knee, and slightly internally rotate your right foot, hip, and knee. And then look down and line up the heel of your left foot with the arch of your right foot. And go back to geometry class. And if you can remember what a 90-degree angle is, bring your front knee to a 90-degree angle. Okay, and then you'll turn your head to look at your left hand, making sure that your wrists are in line with your shoulders. You can even check the other. So this helps us to look like the picture in the book and the shape of Warrior 2. All right, then I'm gonna cue Good, I'm on track. I'm going to cue somatic, use somatic cues for the other side. So step your feet apart to a comfortable distance and turn your right foot out, right knee, right hip, and turn your left foot in. And then lift your arms up, about shoulder height, and bend your knee, and then let's explore. So bring your hands to your two frontal hip points and just notice if they were headlights, which way are they shining? And then explore maybe shining them this way a bit versus this way versus somewhere in the middle, like a Goldilocks, and then pick what feels right for you today. And then with your feet, you pick the position of your feet, but try turning your right foot in a little bit. Notice how that feels. And then try turning your right foot out a little bit. And then decide what feels like a nice position for your foot to be in today. Same thing with your knee. So angle your knee a bit over your big toe, and then maybe over your pinky toe, and then over your second toe. And then decide for today where you want to aim your knee. And then arms are going to float up. And we usually take our gaze to our left, sorry, the front arm, which is your right arm. But for today, I want you to explore what it would be like to look at your back hand instead of your front hand. And then bring your hands to your ribs and just notice which way they're facing. And turn them a little bit to the right and to the left. And just like we did with our two frontal hip points, choose somewhere that feels good for today, and then bring your arms back out. And then go ahead and straighten your right knee, walk your feet together, and we will return back to the PowerPoint. Okay, let me move this a little closer. Put the book back up here just so we have it. All right, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. All right, so this concludes the presentation and the movement portion of today's class. You can find me on my website, which is trinaaltman.com, and then I also have listed here my Facebook and Instagram. But we're going to open up for questions, and I do know that Hillary is going to share a slide as well with a discount for my book.
Trina, before
Yes.
you leave your slides, please continue screen sharing because Marion would like to see the websites that you referenced early on. So would you go back to the opening slide, and
Yes.
Marion and others who were in the chat who were interested in the websites that were referenced, please take a look at this slide. Yes.
Yeah, so feldenkrais.com, and if you just type in Feldenkrais, it should pop up, and somatics.com, and then LeBoninstitute.org is for the Armgard Bartenius work. She worked closely with Rudolf Laban.
Fabulous.
All right.
Okay. And now there's a question from Michael Hall. There you go. And Michael Hall, I'll read it, says, the reason a cheetah runs so fast is due to its flexibility of its spine. When I combined isometric stretches with somatic fascial stretches, my sprinting speed increases. Am I creating changes in my brain, spinal cord kinetic energy for this to happen?
Oh my, that's a wonderfully complex question. I love that. I'm going to answer honestly and say, I don't know. Whenever changes happen, we like to separate things out because that makes things easier. Like, oh, well, I stretched and so I changed my muscle and that's why. But when it comes to stretching, an example would be somebody who, they've done research where somebody who doesn't have a lot of range of motion in their hand, I say hamstring so much. Now I'm trying to say the word hamstrings. That's a good thing. In their hamstrings goes under anesthesia, and they have a lot more range of motion than they do when they are not under anesthesia. So that would tell us that the nervous system is involved, not just the muscle, like your structure, your muscles and your bones and your tendons and your fascia. I think, what I love about science is that there's so much we don't know. What I do know from my experience teaching and practicing is reflects exactly what you said, that when I try to improve my performance in things, whether it's strength and conditioning, whether it's plyometrics, like running, by implementing techniques like PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or static stretching, isometric stretching, somatics, that I do get improvements. And I see that with my students as well. But I'm not a researcher or clinician, so I don't think I can answer it any more definitively than what I did just give you. But I hope that's helpful. And I hope it can continue you on your quest. Who I would recommend is Jules Mitchell. She wrote a book for Handspring called, Science of Stretching? Yoga Biomechanics?
Yoga Biomechanics.
Thank you. And she loves to endlessly dive into the research, and I've studied with her, taken almost all of her continuing education courses over the last probably 8 years. So I highly recommend you dive into that book and her work for more of the details on the research end.
Another question, this one from Valentina Marconi. Are there variations of somatic exercises that do not require being to the floor? I am thinking about the older population. Or is it a matter of including somatic cueing into other movements that can be performed in a seated or standing position?
Yes, I love that question. Valentina, is that correct? What's your name? Yes. So let's see. First part of the question is, does somatics have to be done on the floor? And I hear you. I have a lot of students that getting up and down on the floor is challenging. If they can get down on the floor with help, usually that's what I do with clients or students is, we have objects like chairs so that you're not just going from standing to the floor. There are things you can put your hands on to get down there. And then we stay down there for a while. And then, of course, take our time getting back up, either with help or with lots of props. If that's not possible, though, you can do this on a bed. I'm a Pilates teacher as well, so I've often taught somatics on the Cadillac, which is like a bed, but firmer. So that is one thing. I do think that the firmness of the floor is important and helpful. So if you are doing it on a bed, or a massage table, that at least it's firmer than like a big squishy mattress. And then to your last question, absolutely. I love using somatic cueing, not just when I teach somatics, but when I teach yoga, when I teach Pilates, I teach a lot of strength work with weights to my private clients. And I think having an arsenal of all different types of cueing strategies is best, because different people respond to different things, and different situations call for different types of cues. I think, did I get all of the questions? Is there one more?
Yes.
In that?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Trina, Lou Shapiro is chiming in on the chat with regard to your discussion answering Valentina's question. And as she says, in the case of older people, could the wall be used as the floor in some ways while sitting in a chair or even standing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I encourage you to experiment with that. I think the difference is what's so relaxing about being on the floor, whether you're lying on your belly or your back or your side, is that a lot of muscles don't have to be on, so to speak. But yes, like say if you are in a chair, then that would assist in using a wall. I am a big fan of making sure that if somebody comes to do movement with me, that the most important, like first priority is getting up and down off the floor, because I think it's just so important. So yeah, I think prioritizing that, and a lot of somatics is based on developmental movement patterns. And so I will describe to my students or clients and say, the very first thing you ever learned was, when you were lying on your back, how to roll onto your side, and then how to roll onto your belly. And we want to make sure you can still do that. Or you learned how, when you were on your belly, to build up enough strength to pick up your head. And then you eventually learned, how to get up onto your knees and crawl, and then of course to stand and then to walk. And that these developmental movement patterns that you mastered at a baby, as a baby without any language skills, are just as important now as they were then. So yeah, if you can sort of mix together, this is what I do, the mobility and strength skills of getting up and down off the floor, going from supine to prone, supine to side lying, so the rolling, and hands and knees, with the somatics, whether you do the somatics, in a chair or at the wall, so that they see the progression. And then the other thing I always say is, you don't actually need me to teach you any of this, just get rid of your furniture. Right? Because it is our furniture that prevents us from being able to do these things, because at some point we stop doing them, and then that's when we stop being able to do them. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes. Trina, there are additional questions, but prior to those, given that we have 3 minutes to the hour, let's take a look at the slide that reminds people how to get in touch
Yes.
with you, and also for the discount code for your book. So Trina Altman can be contacted at trinaaltman.com. No dots, no spaces, first and last name. And then her book, Yoga Deconstructed, Movement Science Principles for Teaching, is offered by a 25% off discount code that you see on your screen. And you would order that from Handspring, that provides free shipping in the US and the UK. And we bring your attention also to our next event, which will be Wednesday, February 10th. Penelope Easton is speaking about her book that will be published in late February, March, which is The Alexander Technique, 12 Fundamentals of Integrated Movement. Now, back to the questions for Trina. And Trina, there's a question from Lisa Leader. After trying to move my eyes, as you suggested, while on the floor, I realized that it really isn't comfortable. I have had 2 eye surgeries since October, and now wonder if this can be contributing to my general sense of body unease and disconnect that I am experiencing right now.
That's a great question. Again, I'll start off with, I'm not a doctor, but what I can say is that our eyes are really important in terms of movement. And I would recommend, so a couple things. The physical therapist that I worked with when I had a shoulder injury and I send my clients to has, his name is Sean Hampton, and I can type this in the chat, but he works with people who've had concussions and doing lots of different eye movements in a specific kind of technology. One of my clients was really found very helpful. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is I have other friends and colleagues who have struggled with similar things, and they've really benefited from working with a Z Health practitioner. I have not taken the Z Health training. I've just like learned some of the techniques over the years from people who have. And so that is just the letter Z and then the word health. Dr. Cobb is the founder of that. And this is like really, you know, cutting edge information that it has been around. Another resource is EMDR, which helps with trauma, and it's some eye movements. So like the most basic eye exercise is where, you know, you have your finger out in front of you and you turn your head from side to side, trying to keep your eyes focused on your finger. And then you could do the opposite, where you don't move your head, but you move your finger and you try to track it with your eyes. And I've learned a lot of this stuff through Feldenkrais, and one of my favorite things is how Elizabeth infuses it into Pilates. Especially, I love your reformer classes and mat classes on Pilates Anytime, where you do a lot of eye movements and incorporate Feldenkrais into the Pilates work. So I would say those three resources would be really wonderful to check out. The Z Health, working with a physical therapist who works with patients who've had concussion, and I can give you that. And then let's see, what was the third one? I had a third one and now I lost it. The third one I think was teaching you those exercises that I've learned from some Z Health practitioners.
And Trina, a question from me. You mentioned in your book, which I find so comprehensive, I just love it. You mentioned in your book your own journey of movement practice and movement learning. And like so many of us, we learn by error and trial. But you mentioned your own experience with hypermobility, which led you to create some of your teaching techniques. So would you speak about that?
Sure. Yes. So, you know, these days there are tests that you can do to find out if you have EDS, like Ehlers-Danlos. Now I'm forgetting the name of the other one, Marfan syndrome. I've never been tested. So, you know, I just have a lot of range of motion, and I've always had a lot of range of motion. And so the terminology, a lot of people are saying we shouldn't call it hypermobility anymore, we should call it hyperflexibility. There's so many excellent resources on this topic. But yes, so for me, with my hyperflexibility, hypermobility, what happened was I didn't have as much proprioception because, you know, I'd lift my arm up and it would go behind my head and I wouldn't feel any stretch. You know, from the very young age of, you know, when I started gymnastics at like 3 or 4 years old, I would do the center splits and feel no stretch in my inner thighs. And so when I came into the movement world, this is not my first career. I was investment banker and corporate world and fashion design, all these things. This didn't happen in this career until about 12 or 13 years ago. I really struggled, especially with verbal cues, because I would take yoga classes, Pilates classes, and there was no demoing. It was just verbal cues. And I didn't understand the language. I didn't understand the imagery. And so I really needed things to be deconstructed. And I spent a lot of time learning in one-on-one situations. So taking private lessons from Pilates and gyrotonic teachers, working with physical therapists one-on-one for years, but like full hour out of pocket. Yes, this is America kind of thing. And working with personal trainers, doing strength training one-on-one. And I keep emphasizing the one-on-one because I do feel that when I teach a group class or when I take a group class, right, we can't individualize it to everybody. It's impossible. But when you take a private lesson, you can. And since we're all different, so in my case, with the hypermobility, I really learned proprioception and body awareness that way. And I was able to say, no, I need a visual demo and get one. Whereas in a group class, that maybe wasn't necessarily happening, or I need to add external load like a weight or a resistance band or a Pilates spring or pulley in order to actually feel anything. And so, yes, there have been two, I'd say, advantages to having it as a teacher. One, I had to learn things the hard way, which makes you a better teacher. If something comes easy to you, it's often hard to teach it. And let's see, and then there's a number two, and now it's escaping me. Yes, it's easier. Oh, I can demo anything because of my flexibility. So it's easy to show like protraction and retraction because it's so extreme when you watch my shoulder blades move. And so yes, and then I've been a very strong champion of not glorifying extreme flexibility, which I think happens all the time and is changing. But I was that person where they'd say, well, look at Trina do this pose. This is how it should look, or this is how you should do it. And, it would be something like wheel pose that I had done since I was 3 years old and never felt any stretch and never had any challenge doing. So that was also confusing to me that people are saying like you're achieving a pose, whereas for me, they all came easily to me because of the hyper flexibility. And what I had to learn was how to build tension and create tension, and how important it was, like religiously, to strength train with heavy weights, 2 to 3 times a week in order to do the yoga and Pilates and gyrotonic and more big range of movement methodologies that I love so much.
Trina, how do you recommend that practitioners use your book? Do you think it's best to start at page 1 and read to the end, or do you have a different strategy for recommending?
That's a great question. I think it depends. I'm thinking of myself and when I get a new book and how excited I am. And a lot of times I'll start at the beginning reading and then I'm like, but I look at the table of contents and there's one chapter that is extremely interesting to me. So I'll skip to that. The chapters are divided by topics. So if you get the book and you're like, oh my gosh, I've really been wanting to learn more about pain science and interoception, I think if you skip to that chapter and read about it, you won't be lost in any way. But I did, structure the book in a linear way so that if you do read it from start to finish, it makes a lot of sense. Chapter 8, I structured in such a way so that teachers could create their own classes. So there are different tracks, and what you can do is you can take the whole chapter is filled with the different exercises in each track, and you can create a class by simply picking any exercise you like or movement or pose that's in track 1, and then picking another one in track 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you'll have a class that makes sense because they are also organized in relationship to areas of the body. So 3 general areas: spine, upper body, and lower body focus. And I do teach, I'm actually about to teach an entire 12-hour online immersion called scientific-based sequencing. And it's based on developmental movement patterns. So, starting on the ground with some version of constructive rest in sideline or prone, supine, moving into choosing either a somatic sequence or a sensory feedback method sequence, meaning using some sort of tool like a foam roller or a therapy ball to bring everyone's awareness to the specific area of the body we're going to focus on. And then the track 3 would be some preparatory movements in, say, supine, prone, or side lying, which then move into preparatory movements in seated and or kneeling, which then moves into track 5, which is preparatory movements in standing, which then leads to track 6, which is a more traditional sequence of yoga poses. So you can do like a plug and play and sort of imitate. So I find I learn best by imitating first, like just copying something I learned as it is. And then once I've done that for a while, integrating, so starting to then add in things from other places that I've learned. And then the third phase for me of learning is always innovation. So once I've imitated for a while and then integrated my own things into the thing that I've imitated, I start to innovate and create things that are, from scratch on my own. And so that's how I structured chapter 8 of the book. But everything that leads up to chapter 8, builds on the premise of how to teach a class. There's a lot about trauma-informed teaching. As I mentioned, interoception, proprioception, kinesthetic learning, different types of cueing, and also teaching strategies. So I interviewed a woman who's got her PhD in education from USC about different learning strategies that we have and how you can make sure that you're teaching to all those different strategies rather than just biasing towards one and maybe leaving certain students out.
Beautiful. Trina, thank you very, very much. We're at the end of our hour and 10 or hour and 12. So we'll look forward to studying the YouTube recording and to enjoying your book.
Well, thank you so much, Hillary, and everyone at Handspring, and Elizabeth. You have been a role model for me for a very long time. I'm so grateful to you for leading the way, along with Madeline Black, as far as interdisciplinary movement goes. It was crucial for my process of feeling like it was okay to study multiple movement modalities and incorporate them into my teaching. So I just really appreciative and grateful for Handspring and for this opportunity to share my work.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.